Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to this workshop entitled Building Responsible AI. My name is Alistair Pearson, and I'm a Principal Policy Advisor in the Technology Department at the ICO. And with me is Ahmed Razik, who is a Principal Technical Advisor also within the Technology Department. So today in this workshop, we will be running through our recently published AI and Data Protection Risk Toolkit, which we hope will help organizations out there build responsible AI. This workshop actually comes inside news today that the government has put forward a bill to reform the data protection legislation. And at the ICO, we share this ambition that this bill proposes and supports the package of reform that it sets out. And we will continue to proactively support organizations through our upstream advice and guidance. And we think the toolkit that we're presenting today is a good example of how we support organizations. So a quick overview of what the AI and Data Protection Toolkit is. Oh, sorry, before I move on to that, we do have a quick poll that we would like people to answer quickly. So we'd like to get an understanding of what roles people are attending today have. So we provided you with a few options, and we'd like you to just vote about which best describes your role. So we have risk and governance, whether you work in sort of a risk and governance department, a model development department, or senior leadership one. So I think that poll will work in the background, and hopefully that will give us an idea of who we have in attendance today. But moving on to a quick overview of what the AI and Data Protection Risk Toolkit is. So this toolkit follows on from our guidance on AI and data protection, which was published around 2 years ago. In this guidance, we provide details on what we consider best practice when developing and deploying AI that processes personal data, as well as how we interpret data protection legislation in the context of developing AI. So the toolkit follows on from this guidance and hopefully provides a more practical guide about how to adhere to the requirements set out in data protection legislation. So the structure of the toolkit helps organizations to identify risks to individual rights and freedoms that AI systems could cause or exacerbate. It connects those risks to the UK GDPR, so you understand which part of the legislation each risk relates to. And finally, we've also provided a list of practical steps to help mitigate the risks and make compliance with the law more likely. So we hope that these practical steps help you address some of the risks. I'll now hand over to Ahmed, who will talk you through more about how the structure of the AI and Data Protection Risk Toolkit.
Hello there, everybody. So we've structured the toolkit closely following the AI lifecycle, and that is looking at the toolkit from, the lifecycle starts with the business requirements and design stage. Following on from that, it's the data acquisition preparation stage, training and testing, and then finally deployment and monitoring. So if you go through the toolkit, it will be in that order. Now, clearly, when you're developing any AI system, it's not a linear process like that, and we would expect that people using the toolkit will refer to different sections at different times depending on where they are. So this diagram really illustrates that how fluid and kind of what actually happens within an AI system. Back to you, Alistair.
Thanks, Ahmed. So we were keen to cover all of the principles that are set out in the data protection legislation. So you can see those on your screen now. We've also got some around individual rights and also meaningful human review, which we see as areas of increased importance when it comes to using AI to process personal data. These risk areas we've tried to tailor with the different life cycle stages that Ahmed just described. So for example, taking fairness, we look at specific risks to fairness that may be present in the initial design phase and sort of track the risks as they evolve into the training and development, testing, and as well as deploying and ongoing monitoring. So most of these risk areas are tracked across the different life cycle stages and are sort of tailored to the life cycle stages as well. For the practical steps that we provide, we've tried to use consistent language to describe each practical step that we make, and we've divided them into three categories. So there are the must steps that you must take, and these are where it is a legal requirement. So either the law explicitly states that you must do this, or it's hard to comply with the law without complying, without taking those practical steps. A step that you should take, and this is what we consider to be best practice in the area and the best way to comply with the legislation. However, we recognise that organisations are responsible for complying with the legislation and being able to demonstrate their compliance. And we recognise that there may be alternative ways of complying. And therefore, although they are considered best practice, we are open to there being other ways of mitigating the risks that we've identified. And finally, there are practical steps that are phrased as you could do this. And these are sort of optional good practice. And we say optional because it may be that you're working in a particular context where the practical steps are sort of non-applicable or less relevant for you. And therefore, they can just be used as sort of illustrative practical steps to mitigate the risks. And you may well have alternative ways of reducing the risk. So who is the toolkit for? So we've identified three sort of broad areas where we think the toolkit will be useful and provide practical support for these teams. So first we have risk and governance teams. So particular roles in this could be your data protection officer or those working in the data protection office. Other legal and compliance roles as well may find this useful when going through their sort of risk assessments. We also have the model development teams, so particularly for the risks and practical steps that we identify in the training and testing phases. We think the toolkit would be useful for them because it enables them to know which problems they need to solve, identify, provide technical measures to reduce the risk of, etc. So we hope that model development teams find this toolkit useful. And finally, we got senior leadership. So although within data protection law, it is the data controller who has overall responsibility of complying with the law. In a practical sense, it usually comes down to a member of the senior leadership of that organization team who will sign off on the use and deployment of an AI system. And therefore, we think it's crucial that senior leadership teams in charge of signing these projects off have a good and informed understanding of the risks that AI can introduce and an understanding of what practical steps can be taken to mitigate and reduce those risks. And we're increasingly seeing the importance of senior leaderships being able to identify and able to understand how risks are being mitigated. So just quickly going back to the poll to understand the different people made up of this. So we've got a pretty overwhelming majority of people saying that they belong in the first category here, so the risk and governance team, 80%. A very small minority in the model development of 2%, and the remaining 18% in the senior leadership. So hopefully each one of you that have voted can sort of see why the toolkit could be useful for you in your everyday work on AI. So what are the benefits of using the toolkit? So I've alluded a few times in this talk that by using the toolkit, it will enable organizations to have a greater confidence that they are compliant with data protection law. A key part of data protection law is taking a risk-based approach, which means that you don't need to completely eradicate any chance of risk, but instead, by taking a risk-based approach, you can understand how big a particular risk is and then take appropriate and proportionate mitigations to reduce that risk. And hopefully this toolkit provides you with a number of practical steps to enable you to do that. Secondly, we hope that it helps organizations to understand the risks that individual rights caused by AI systems. So in our experience of looking at data protection impact assessments, for example, we see that a common problem that organizations are not sort of addressing is that within their data protection impact assessments, they're not properly assessing the risk to individual rights, and instead are more sort of concerned with organizational risks. So the risk of receiving a fine from the regulator or being reprimanded by the regulator and how that may affect them as a business. But really, data protection is about understanding the risks to individual and people's personal data. So this toolkit will help you identify some of those risks, as well as how to mitigate them. And finally, we hope that the toolkit provides clarity for organizations about the law and enables them to innovate responsibly. So at the ICO, we recognize the great potential of AI systems, and there are already a number of cases where AI has been able to achieve great efficiencies and great results for people and businesses alike. And we want to encourage this sort of safe and responsible innovation. And we think the best way to do this is to provide helpful guidance that enables organizations to understand the law, and in turn, which will enable them to innovate responsibly. So what are our next steps? So we're looking to hear for experiences of organizations who have used the toolkit in a sort of live AI project. So we're keen to know how you've used the toolkit, what practical steps from the toolkit you've used to reduce some of the risks in your particular context. And also we're keen to hear of other ways that you may have addressed the risks that we've identified in the toolkit. AI is a rapidly evolving technology, and as such, it will include sort of rapidly evolving technical and organizational methods to reduce the risks. So we want to continue to hear from you about how you're doing this to improve our knowledge and understanding. So if after this talk you do want to see how this toolkit works in your particular context, and then want to write a few thoughts and ideas and experiences of how you've used the toolkit and send it to us, our email is there at the bottom of the page, ai@ico.org.uk. And moving forward, we want to continue to develop practical products that help organizations use AI to process personal data lawfully. So we recognize that AI can be a complex technology, and data protection law can be a complex legislation. Together, it can be difficult to know how to comply. And therefore, we want to continue to provide products that make it easier for organizations to know what responsibilities they have. So that is the end of our talk about the risk toolkit. But before moving on to the question and answer session, we just have a second poll for you to answer. So the question for this is, how likely are you that you're going to use the toolkit moving forward and in a live AI project that you may be involved in? And I can't quite remember the options, but it's something like very likely, likely, not very likely, neither likely nor unlikely. So it would be good to get an indication from you about how practical you think the toolkit is for after this presentation. And whilst you're answering that poll, we can start moving on to the questions.
Okay, Alistair. We've had a few questions here. I'll ask you a few and then I'll jump in with any additional thoughts, if that works. So we've had a question here that asks, how does this toolkit impact / work with the government's new AI paper?
I think it's too early to tell at the moment in terms of at the ICA we need to do sort of further analysis of what the likely impact of the UK government's new AI paper has for data protection. Obviously there will be differences, but hopefully it aligns nicely because both the toolkit and the government's new AI paper, the overarching aims are the same in terms of we want to help build responsible AI and to encourage responsible innovation. Ahmed, is there anything like that?
Yeah, just to reinforce what you said, I don't think there's anything that is conflicting in any way. I think this work complements, so it's well worth we'll have to do that analysis, as you said, and yeah, I think this should hopefully complement the work going forward. Next, okay, how do algorithmic risk assessments fit in with this toolkit?
Yeah, a good question, and one we've done a bit of thinking about. So our understanding at the moment is that algorithmic risk assessments are sort of optional, in some cases best practice assessments that organizations can choose to carry out. And this toolkit, we hope, complements that assessment. So hopefully the risks identified in the toolkit can be used to form part of the algorithmic risk assessment and give you ideas about what risks to consider, as well as how to address those risks as well. Ahmed, anything to add?
Yeah, I agree. It should be a complement, but I think even within algorithmic risk assessments, it's really early days, and so we're not sure particularly what there's no particular standard out there for algorithmic risk assessment. So I think there's still a lot of work to understand how this will work and how actually impactful algorithmic risk assessments are unto themselves as well. So I think it's probably a little bit too early to have a form of good judgment.
And I think linked to that, do you also have thoughts about how the toolkit is supposed to supplement a data protection impact assessment will be used instead?
Yeah, I think having worked on this toolkit and looked at DPAs, I think this can really get you thinking about the specific AI risks, and that should be documented as part of your DPIA. So that's how I'm seeing how this toolkit can really enhance your DPIA and get you to really think about things like the statistical accuracy of your model, for instance, or if there's any model drift, that stuff that you might not have kind of initially considered as part of your DPIA. This toolkit will help you identify those risks, and then hopefully it will inform and help you produce a more well-rounded DPIA, especially in the context of AI. So, do you have anything to add on that?
No, I think covered that really well.
Okay, so we have another question here that says, to what extent does ICO proposals differ from EU AI Act? which intends to group all applications of AI into 3 categories: unacceptable risk, higher risk applications, and acceptable risk.
Yeah, this is a good question, very topical as well, and we continue to monitor the developments of the EU AI Act. We also responded to the initial consultation on the EU AI Act, and you can look at our response on the ICA's website if you go to the responses to stakeholder consultations page as well. So that, yeah, as the question states, the EU AI Act does group different applications into the 3 categories. I think comparing and contrasting that with data protection legislation, I think, yeah, data protection legislation has fewer categories in terms of it just has sort of likely to result in high risk, and anything that falls outside of that category as well. And I think when you look at how data protection sort of it clarifies and elucidates what it means by likely to result in high risk, you sort of suddenly see that the vast majority of AI applications fall into this category of likely to result in high risk. That may be due to the potential of causing bias and discrimination. It may be because it has the potential to process personal data on a large scale. It may be processing special category data on a large scale. It may be used for profiling. It may be used to make automated decisions with legal or significantly similar effects. Yeah, once you break down all the different ways that AI can use, it seems like in the majority of cases, it will be likely to fall into the high risk category. And this comes with additional responsibilities, including the requirement to fill out a data protection impact assessment. And I think, again, so where it kind of aligns with the EU AI Act is this idea of like unacceptable risk. As part of sort of data protection impact assessment requirements, if you do identify a risk that you can't sufficiently mitigate, then this falls into like an additional category where you have to then consult with the ICO, and the ICO or with the chosen supervisory authority, and then the ICO sort of makes a decision about whether the processing can go ahead or not. So that kind of aligns with the first category there. And then in terms of like acceptable risk, I think this goes back to sort of the risk-based approach that data protection takes. So acceptable risk here is just where you're not going to be able to completely remove any or all of the risk, but you sufficiently mitigate it to a level where it is acceptable. So I think, yeah, the data protection legislation sort of does align quite closely with the EU AI Act, and I think it's telling in how it sort of compiled the EU AI Act that it follows sort of the structure of how GDPR was laid out. So you can kind of see the thinking behind it.
I think we are really comfortable and happy with our approach. If in reference to the specific toolkit, you know, we've been trying to be as clear as possible with the musts, shoulds, and coulds, so that should help you in your navigating there. Okay, let's have a look. Got so many questions. Sorry, I'm trying to keep up. Please give some examples of public sector projects which you've helped by working with them to take on responsible use of AI.
I think at this moment it would be unfair to reveal much details around which public sector projects that you're working with, just because we haven't agreed with them that we would share details on that. However, okay.
No, so I'm just teeing you up, Alistair, to reinforce the call to action to the audience to say that we welcome further case studies, and we'd love to publish them.
Yeah, I suppose like we obviously recognise that the use of AI in the public sector carries a sort of greater significant concern just because of the amount of people that may be affected by the use of AI in the public sector. So we're always sort of keen to engage with any public sector body working on a project that may have a significant impact on the public, to help them go through the risks and make sure that they innovate responsibly.
Another question here, interesting one. Is there a threshold for when you'd expect the toolkit to be used? For example, if machine learning is used for internal planning versus it changing how data subjects get treated in some way?
So we don't have any expectations of organizations to use this toolkit. The toolkit is very much there to provide you with support if and when you need it. So there'll be no sort of punishment or any sort of judgment from us as the regulator if you don't use the toolkit. And as we're keen to reinforce the message that there can be multiple different ways of complying with the legislation, and you could achieve perfect compliance without using the toolkit at all. So in that respect, there's no sort of threshold of when you should use this toolkit against when you shouldn't. It's just there as a support and practical guidance should you need it. Appreciate that there is a difference in terms of the likely risks if it's being used for internal planning versus to make decisions about data subjects, which could infer that you're more likely to gain benefit of it if it was to be used to affect data subjects. But we don't want to be overly prescriptive of when to use the toolkit.
There's a question from earlier, and I'll add a slight change to this. So can the toolkit be applied to Part 3 processing? If not, would the ICO consider producing one? And my slight addition to that is, what are the future plans for this toolkit as well, Alistair?
So in terms of Part 3 processing, so this is just to clarify for anyone in the audience unsure. So this is part of the Data Protection Act that legislates the use of personal data in a law enforcement context. So any law enforcement bodies or those with law enforcement responsibilities processing data in the context of law enforcement would have to follow Part 3. So this toolkit at the moment is very much made in respect to UK GDPR. And although there are close similarities with Part 3, there are some differences. So the toolkit can only be applied so far if you are a law enforcement body. There are currently no plans to produce a toolkit for the use of law enforcement bodies. However, I would direct you to a previous bit of work that the ICO has done, and we've provided a different kind of toolkit for law enforcement bodies that are using data analytics. So this goes through the sort of principles within Part 3 that you need to comply with, how the use of data analytics may create implications for your compliance, and ways of ensuring compliance as well. So if you type in data analytics toolkit on the ICO website, you should be able to find it, and hopefully that will help you. But if you do have any specific questions about how to comply with Part 3, then feel free to email us at ai@ico.org.uk. Apologies, I forgot the second part of your question that you sort of modified.
It's just general plans, future plans for the toolkit. Are there any other areas perhaps that you might explore?
Sure, yeah, I think there are several areas where, because it is such a dynamic and fast-moving area, we'll need to continue to update the toolkit. So, for example, security in AI systems is a rapidly evolving area. There are sort of new security attacks and security risks that researchers are uncovering and different ways of mitigating those risks as well. So I foresee that being a part that we'll need to update in the future. Fairness as well, that's an ongoing debate, both in sort of an academic environment, but also more broadly in society. And there are a number of different ways of assessing fairness and measuring fairness. So we'll continue to track those and update the toolkit in appropriate ways there. And finally, I think transparency is another big one. So there's lots of sort of research going into how to sort of best explain decisions that are made by black box models, for example. So as that research sort of develops and matures, I'm sure that will be another area that we'll look to improve the toolkit on.
If I could just add a potential area as well that it's of interest is around procuring these AI systems. So actually quite often you're probably not going to be developing in-house AI and you'll be taking things off the shelf, so to speak. So I think there could be a potential scope for looking at how procurement might work as well. But that is for future development. Okay, Alistair, the second poll results quite gratifying. 74% say they are likely to use the toolkit, 3% to say unlikely, and 22% are neither likely nor unlikely. So I think that's a pretty good result. Back to the questions. I'm not sure how well you'll be able to answer this, but let's give it a go. It seems Singapore has a relatively mature AI framework. Is there potential for the UK to comment or align the frameworks? Do you know much about the Singapore AI framework, Alistair?
I do not, unfortunately, but yeah, I'd love to hear that person provide more of their thoughts about why they think the Singapore framework is good. I know they said relatively mature, so I don't know if that's a comment on it being good or not. But yeah, again, if they want to email more thoughts on that, I think that would be useful. Potential for the UK to align the frameworks. I mean, obviously the UK government is in control of how the data protection framework in the UK is developed. So, I mean, the ICO role could be to look at it and to suggest areas of where it could be aligned. But yeah, without looking at it closely, I can't really comment.
Okay. Final questions. I think we've answered most of the questions. Do you have, in the last couple of minutes, Alistair, do you have anything that you would, any takeaways for our audience in terms of, we're asking them to send in some of their case studies. Is there anything else that they should be leaving with?
No, just to re-emphasize, yeah, keen to hear experiences, both of using the toolkit, but also like just other ways that you are addressing some of the more significant risks within data protection in your particular context. So I mentioned a few earlier about sort of fairness, security, transparency. We are always keen to learn more and understand more. So yeah, feel free to get in touch with us at the email address. But yeah, do you have any takeaways that you can think of?
No, I think we would love to get a range of case studies in particular different sectors like health and finance. So would particularly encourage those areas, but we really are keen to publish best practice case studies and making sure that learning's spread far and wide into the community. So would really encourage that, and we're quite happy to work quite closely with those organizations to get it over the line.
Yeah, and then I guess just a general call. I mean, as we sort of mentioned at the start, the ICO wants to promote responsible innovation, and we want to support organizations to innovate as well. So any sort of issues, confusion, uncertainties about how to comply with the law when sort of developing and deploying AI or procuring AI, as Ahmed mentioned earlier, any issues there, please let us know, and we can assess them and see the best way of providing support there. We're fastly approaching the end of the session. There is just a quick question here about, do you have any AI projects in the ICO sandbox? And if you do, please describe them. So we do have a list of the current sandbox entries on our website, so more details will be available there. But very quickly, just to mention one sandbox project, we've got an entry from, I can't remember the name of the company, which is bad, but essentially they are working in the finance space and they're developing an AI chatbot, which aims to improve young people's attitude towards money and looks to help to improve them in terms of their spending habits, with the view that it will sort of improve their likelihood of obtaining loans and other financial products in the future. So that's quite an interesting project, looking at the chatbot in a sort of specific financial context. And we'll continue to support that application as it goes through the sandbox and through to sort of development and deployment. But yeah, as I say, there'll be more details on the ICO's website there. So I think all that's left to say is thank you very much for joining us today. And we really hope that you found this session useful. We're also aware that this will be the final workshop of the Data Protection Practitioners Conference today. So again, thank you for attending the conference today, and we hope the other sessions were useful too. Hopefully in the future we'll be able to host this in person so we can do a bit more networking. We'd like to encourage you to fill out the feedback form that will be sent to each delegate. I think the aim there is to send it tomorrow. So we'd really be keen to hear your input on how you found the conference today, as your input really helps us to shape future events in this space. And finally, we'd also just like to signal again that there is a virtual meeting hub that is available for delegates today, and this is open until 4:30. So if the delegates would like to meet up after the conference closes, I think you should have a link available there. But if not, and you're leaving, hope you enjoy the rest of your day and it's not too unbearably hot wherever you are and you're able to get some relief from it. But yeah, thank you very much for listening to us today.